The city of Brookhaven had always been proud of its reputation. It was the kind of place people moved to when they wanted a quieter life, far from the noise and danger of bigger cities. Tree-lined streets stretched through calm neighborhoods. Small cafes opened early for regular customers, and most crimes were limited to stolen bicycles or late-night arguments that never turned violent. People trusted each other here. Doors were often left unlocked, and parents felt safe letting their children walk home alone. That sense of comfort made what happened next even more disturbing, because no one saw it coming, and no one believed it could happen there. The first body was discovered just after sunrise on a Tuesday morning, behind a grocery store that had closed years earlier. Rain had fallen through the night, leaving the ground wet and the air heavy. A delivery driver taking a shortcut noticed something lying near the dumpsters and assumed it was trash. When he got closer, he froze. The man was lying on his side, eyes open, staring at nothing. His clothes were clean, his shoes polished, and there were no signs of a struggle around him. Police arrived within minutes, blocking off the alley as curious onlookers gathered at a distance. The victim was identified as Thomas Reed, a 46-year-old community counselor known for his work with rehabilitation programs. He had no criminal record, no known enemies, and no history of risky behavior. His wallet was still in his pocket with cash untouched, his phone fully charged, and his car parked neatly 2 streets away. The medical examiner later confirmed the cause of death was deliberate and controlled, not rushed or emotional. Whoever killed Thomas knew exactly what they were doing. At first, the police treated it as an isolated incident. They searched for possible muggings in the area, questioned nearby residents, and reviewed security cameras. Nothing stood out. The cameras had malfunctioned that night, and no one reported hearing anything unusual. Brookhaven had no recent history of violent crime, and investigators assumed this was a rare, tragic event. Life went on, though people were a little more cautious. Then, 3 months later, another body was found. This time it was near a public park, early in the morning before joggers arrived. The victim was a man in his early 50s named Alan Cooper, a former schoolteacher who now volunteered at a local outreach center. Like the first victim, he was well-dressed, with no signs of robbery or chaos. Again, there were no witnesses, no clear suspects, and no immediate motive. 2 deaths might still be coincidence, but the similarities were hard to ignore. Both men were respected members of the community. Both were killed quietly. Both cases felt unusually clean, almost careful. Still, detectives hesitated to label it anything more than bad luck. Serial killers existed in movies in big cities, not places like Brookhaven. Over the next several months, the unease grew heavier. A third body was discovered near an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. A fourth was found in a quiet residential street, inside a parked car. Each time, the same strange details appeared. No theft, no forced entry, no messages left behind. The victims varied in age and background, but all were men who lived modest lives and avoided trouble. The city began to change. People locked their doors at night. Neighborhood watch groups formed. Local news stations ran constant updates, even though there was little new information to share. Police held press conferences asking for patience while secretly struggling to find a single solid lead. The public demanded answers, but the truth was that investigators were lost. There was no weapon connecting the cases. No DNA that led to a match. The killer didn't rush or panic. There were no mistakes, no obvious emotions left behind. It was as if the murders were being committed by someone who had rehearsed them carefully in their mind long before acting. What made the situation even more confusing was the lack of a clear pattern. The victims lived in different neighborhoods, worked in different places, and had different routines. The times of death varied. The locations varied. To most officers, it looked like unrelated cases forced together by coincidence. But coincidence has limits. The 5th death changed the tone of the investigation completely. The victim was found inside his office late one evening, long after the building should have been empty. His name was Richard Nolan, a social worker who had spent years advocating for second chances. He spoke publicly about forgiveness, rehabilitation, and the belief that people could change if given support. When detectives searched Richard's office, they found nothing disturbed. Files were neatly arranged. His computer was shut down properly. The windows were locked. Whoever entered that office had either been invited in or had access without raising suspicion. That was when a quiet realization began to spread through the department. Every victim had worked with people recently released from prison. At first, this detail seemed unimportant. Many community members volunteered in outreach programs. Brookhaven prided itself on helping former offenders rebuild their lives. But as investigators dug deeper, the connection grew stronger. Each victim had played an active role in supporting individuals convicted of serious crimes. They wrote recommendations, organized programs, and spoke publicly about rehabilitation. It was no longer random. Someone was choosing these victims deliberately. Still, the reason remained unclear. None of the victims had mistreated anyone. None had acted irresponsibly. They followed the law, helped others, and were praised for their compassion. If anything, they were admired. That made the situation far more unsettling. The killer wasn't targeting criminals. They were targeting people who helped criminals. The idea was hard to accept. Why would anyone want to punish those who believed in forgiveness? What kind of anger could turn such belief into a death sentence? As the city struggled to understand, the killer remained invisible, watching, waiting, studying. They knew where their victims worked. They knew when they were alone. They knew how to approach them without causing alarm. And worst of all, they hadn't finished yet. Brookhaven still believed it was dealing with a mystery that could be solved quickly. They believed safety would return once the right suspect was found. What they didn't realize was that this killer wasn't acting out of impulse or rage. This was something colder, something shaped by belief. And belief, when twisted into certainty, can be more dangerous than hatred. The pattern had begun, even if no one wanted to admit it. By the time the sixth death occurred, Brookhaven no longer felt like the same city. The streets were still clean, the shops still open, but something invisible had settled over the town like a fog. Conversations lowered when strangers walked by. Parents checked the locks twice before going to bed. People who once smiled at each other now avoided eye contact, unsure who might be watching. The police department was under constant pressure. Every morning brought new calls from reporters, community leaders, and frightened residents. The mayor demanded progress. Families of the victims demanded justice. Behind closed doors, detectives argued, retraced steps, and reviewed evidence again and again, hoping they had missed something obvious. The sixth victim was found in the parking lot of a small church on the east side of town. His name was Samuel Porter, a youth mentor who worked with young offenders trying to rebuild their lives. He had stayed late that evening, helping organize a workshop scheduled for the next day. When a janitor arrived early the following morning, he noticed Samuel's car still parked under a flickering light. Inside, Samuel sat in the driver's seat, lifeless, his hands resting calmly in his lap. There were no signs of panic, no broken glass, no forced entry. It was as if Samuel had simply sat down, unaware that he would never stand up again. This time, however, something was different. Tucked carefully inside Samuel's jacket pocket was a folded piece of paper. It wasn't hidden, but it wasn't placed carelessly either. It felt intentional, almost respectful. When detectives opened it, they found a single sentence written in neat, steady handwriting. Some sins should never be forgiven. The message changed everything. Until then, investigators had been struggling to understand the killer's motive. The victims seemed unrelated beyond their work, and even that connection felt vague. But the note suggested judgment. Not rage, not revenge, but judgment. Someone had decided these people deserved to die. The discovery shook the department. Notes were rare in serial cases, and when they appeared, they often signaled confidence. This killer wasn't afraid anymore. They wanted to be understood. Detective Laura Finch read the note over and over. She was younger than most of her colleagues, newer to homicide, and often overlooked during meetings. But something about this case had settled deeply in her mind. She felt it wasn't about the deaths themselves, but about the idea behind them. Laura began reviewing the victims' backgrounds again, this time not looking for mistakes or secrets, but for beliefs. She read old interviews, watched recorded speeches, and studied opinion pieces they had written. A pattern emerged that went beyond volunteering. Every victim had publicly supported rehabilitation. They had spoken about forgiveness. They had defended early release programs and parole hearings. They believed people could change. Laura shared her thoughts during a late-night meeting. Some officers listened politely. Others dismissed it as overthinking. Lots of people believe that, one detective said. That doesn't make them targets. But the note suggested otherwise. Some sin should never be forgiven wasn't random. It was a statement. A philosophy. The killer wasn't acting blindly. They were enforcing their own sense of justice. As days passed, more unsettling details surfaced. The killer seemed to know the victim's schedules perfectly. They struck when the victim was alone, relaxed, and unsuspecting. There were no defensive wounds, suggesting the victims trusted whoever approached them. That meant the killer didn't look threatening. They blended in. Police began quietly interviewing people connected to rehabilitation programs. Volunteers, former offenders, administrative staff. The conversations were cautious. No one wanted to suggest that helping others could make someone a target. But fear was spreading within those circles. Some volunteers stopped showing up. Others asked to have their names removed from public records. The very programs meant to rebuild lives were now shrinking, driven by fear. The killer's rule was becoming clear. They didn't kill randomly. They killed selectively. Only those who defended forgiveness. Only those who stood between criminals and punishment. Only one type of victim. As investigators worked, the killer continued watching. They followed the news closely, noting which details were shared and which were kept secret. The note had done exactly what they wanted. It forced the police to think differently. It forced the city to ask uncomfortable questions. Late one night, Laura stayed behind after everyone else had left. She spread files across a desk, reading until her eyes burned. The victims' faces stared back at her, calm and unaware. She wondered if they had ever sensed danger, if any of them had questioned their beliefs in their final moments. Then she noticed something subtle. The killer's methods varied slightly, but the timing was always precise. The murders didn't happen on anniversaries or symbolic dates. They happened shortly after the victim had publicly supported a specific case. A parole hearing. A letter of recommendation. A public statement defending early release. The killings weren't about the past. They were about preventing the future. Someone believed that stopping these people would stop forgiveness itself. The department began consulting behavioral experts. The profile that emerged was unsettling. The killer was likely intelligent, organized, and deeply convinced of their moral superiority. They didn't see themselves as evil. They saw themselves as necessary. This wasn't revenge against a specific person. This was a mission. Meanwhile, the media intensified its coverage. Talk shows debated whether the killer had a point. Comment sections filled with arguments about justice and mercy. Some voices, quietly at first, expressed understanding for the anger behind the murders. That frightened Laura more than anything else, because it meant the killer wasn't alone in their thinking. At a press conference, the police chief urged calm and asked the public not to speculate. He avoided mentioning the note, but rumors spread quickly. The sentence appeared online within hours, shared without context, turning into a slogan for anger. Some sins should never be forgiven. It appeared on forums, graffiti, even handwritten signs left anonymously near crime scenes. The killer's idea was spreading. Laura realized that catching this person wasn't just about stopping more deaths. It was about stopping a belief from turning into permission. As the investigation deepened, one thing became painfully clear. The killer wasn't afraid of being caught. They believed they were right. And when someone believes that completely, they don't rush. They don't panic. They follow rules. Rules only they understand. Rules that decide who deserves to live and who doesn't. By the time Brookhaven reached its breaking point, fear had begun to turn into anger. People no longer asked whether the police would catch the killer. They asked why they hadn't already. The mayor's office was flooded with calls. News vans lined the streets outside the police department every morning. Online forums buzzed with theories, accusations, and demands for swift justice. In a city that once trusted its institutions without question, doubt now grew louder each day. Under this pressure, the investigation shifted. The careful, patient approach that had defined the early months gave way to urgency. Detectives were told to narrow their focus. Command staff wanted a name, a face, someone they could point to and say the threat was contained. It was during this tense period that Marcus Hale entered the spotlight. Marcus was 32 years old and had been released from prison 2 years earlier after serving time for aggravated assault. He had struggled to adjust to life outside. Employment had been difficult, relationships unstable, and anger simmered just beneath the surface. What made him stand out to investigators was his connection to two of the victims. Both had worked directly with him during his rehabilitation. Both had written progress reports describing his behavior as volatile but improving. Then came the social media posts. Marcus had posted long, angry messages criticizing the justice system, rehabilitation programs, and people who believed criminals deserved second chances. In one post, he wrote that forgiveness was a lie that only creates more victims. The word spread quickly once reporters discovered them. To the public, it sounded like a confession waiting to happen. Police brought Marcus in for questioning late one evening. Cameras followed him as he was escorted into the station, his face tense, eyes darting toward the flashing lights. Within hours, his name was everywhere. Headlines labeled him a person of interest, but the message was clear. The city believed they had found their killer. During interrogation, Marcus was defensive but cooperative. He admitted he was angry. He admitted he felt betrayed by the system. He admitted he hated the idea of forgiveness. But when asked directly about the murders, his response was immediate and consistent. He denied any involvement. Laura Finch sat behind the glass, watching closely. Something felt wrong. Marcus was angry, yes, but his anger was chaotic. It spilled out in bursts, uncontrolled and emotional. The killer they were looking for was nothing like that. The murders were calm, deliberate, and patient. Marcus felt like someone who exploded, not someone who planned. Still, the pressure to act was overwhelming. Investigators focused on Marcus's past, combing through his movements, his associations, his finances. They found that he lived near one of the crime scenes. They found he had missed a meeting with his parole officer around the time of another murder. Small details were stretched into possible evidence. The media did the rest. Marcus's face filled television screens. Commentators discussed his criminal history as if it explained everything. Neighbors were interviewed, some claiming they had always felt uneasy around him. Others admitted they barely knew him but weren't surprised. Brookhaven wanted this nightmare to end, and Marcus fit the story people were ready to believe. When Marcus was formally arrested, applause broke out outside the courthouse. Candles were lit for the victims. The mayor praised law enforcement for their dedication. For a brief moment, the city exhaled. But Laura couldn't shake the feeling that they had made a terrible mistake. She reviewed Marcus's timeline in silence, long after everyone else had gone home. She compared it carefully against the known times of death. 2 of the murders overlapped with moments when Marcus had verifiable alibis. Surveillance footage placed him at a bus station miles away during one killing. Phone records showed him on a monitor call during another. These weren't weak alibis. They were solid. Laura brought her concerns to her supervisor the next morning. He listened, tired and distracted, and told her they would look into it. She knew what that meant. The case was already moving forward. Backtracking would be embarrassing. Public confidence would shatter all over again. Days passed, and Marcus remained in custody. His lawyer pushed back aggressively, releasing alibi details to the press. Doubt began to creep into public opinion, but it was drowned out by fear. Many people didn't care if the evidence was perfect. They wanted someone punished. Then, on a cold Thursday night, everything fell apart. The 7th body was discovered in a downtown office building. The victim was found in a stairwell shortly after midnight by a security guard. He was another volunteer, another advocate for rehabilitation, another man who believed in second chances. Marcus was still in jail. There was no way to explain it. The news broke within hours. The city woke up to headlines that felt like a punch to the chest. The killer was still free. The arrest had been wrong. The relief people had felt turned instantly into rage. Protesters gathered outside the police department, holding signs demanding accountability. The mayor canceled all public appearances. Reporters pressed officers with brutal questions about rushed investigations and tunnel vision. Inside the department, morale collapsed. Marcus was released the same day, his name publicly cleared. But the damage to his life was permanent. He left town quietly, escorted by his attorney, avoiding cameras that once chased him eagerly. For Laura, his release felt like a small correction in a much larger failure. The killer had struck again, calmly and confidently, almost as if to prove a point. Laura returned to the evidence with renewed focus. She ignored public opinion and internal politics. She reminded herself that the truth didn't care about pressure. It didn't move faster because people demanded it. She asked a different question than everyone else. Not who was angry enough to kill, but who was calm enough to wait. The killer had watched Marcus take the blame and did nothing to stop it. They hadn't panicked. They hadn't changed their behavior. They simply continued. That meant they felt untouchable. Laura examined the case files again, this time removing the victims from the center of the story. Instead, she focused on access. Who knew their schedules? Who knew when they were alone? Who knew where cameras were located or not functioning? She noticed something subtle but disturbing. The killer never forced their way in. They were always let in. That meant familiarity, trust, or authority. Laura made a list of everyone who had regular contact with all the victims. Volunteers didn't overlap much. Former offenders rarely interacted with multiple programs. But administrative staff did. Coordinators, case managers, schedulers, people no one paid attention to. As the city argued and pointed fingers, Laura quietly began shifting the investigation in a new direction. She didn't announce it. She didn't ask permission. She simply followed the pattern that others had missed. The wrong suspect had nearly ended the case for good. The real killer had watched from the shadows, patient and confident, waiting for belief to blind everyone else. And for the first time since the murders began, Laura felt close. Not to an arrest, but to the truth. When Laura Finch finally focused her attention away from the victims and toward the system surrounding them, the case began to feel different. It no longer felt like a chase through darkness. It felt like a quiet room where something dangerous had been sitting the entire time, unnoticed because it never moved. While the rest of the department tried to recover from the public embarrassment of the wrong arrest, Laura worked quietly, often alone, driven by a growing certainty that the killer was closer than anyone wanted to believe. She started with access. Every victim had been approached without fear. There were no signs of forced entry, no defensive wounds, no sudden panic. These men had either known their killer or believed the person in front of them was harmless. That ruled out strangers lurking in the dark. This was someone who fit naturally into their lives, someone who belonged. Laura requested internal records from the rehabilitation programs, framing it as a routine review. She wasn't looking for offenders this time. She was looking for staff, schedulers, administrators, coordinators, and assistants. The people who arranged meetings, handled files, and moved quietly through offices without being noticed. The kind of people who were trusted simply because they were always there. One name appeared again and again. Daniel Cross. At first, there was nothing remarkable about him. Daniel was 38 years old, unmarried, and had worked as an administrative coordinator for nearly a decade. His job was simple on paper. He scheduled counseling sessions, kept records, assigned volunteers to cases, and maintained communication between programs. He wasn't a public figure. He never gave speeches or wrote opinion pieces. He stayed in the background. But Daniel's name was on every list. He had access to every victim's schedule. He knew where they worked late, when they were alone, and which locations had limited security. He was the one who arranged after-hours meetings. He was the one who assigned office spaces. He was the one who handled records that included personal details most people never saw. Laura felt a chill as she realized how invisible that made him. She began asking questions about Daniel, casually at first. Co-workers described him as quiet, polite, and reliable. He rarely missed work. He never argued. Some struggled to remember conversations with him at all. He simply blended into the routine of the office, like furniture that had always been there. That invisibility suddenly felt intentional. Laura dug deeper, requesting Daniel's employment history and background check. What she found raised more questions than answers. Large sections of his file were sealed. Not expunged, but sealed by court order. That alone was unusual for someone in a civilian administrative role. After pushing through layers of approval, Laura finally gained access. Daniel Cross had a sister. Her name was Emily Cross. 10 years earlier, Emily had been murdered during a late-night robbery. The man responsible had a long criminal history and was out on early parole at the time. The case had shaken the city briefly before fading into memory. What hadn't faded was the parole hearing that followed. Several people had written letters supporting the offender's early release. 2 of those letters came from men who were now dead. Laura sat in silence as the truth began to assemble itself piece by piece. This wasn't random. This wasn't ideological in the abstract. This was deeply personal. Daniel hadn't lashed out in grief. He hadn't attacked the man who killed his sister. He had turned his anger toward the system that allowed it to happen, toward the people who defended that system, toward those who believed forgiveness should outweigh punishment. In Daniel's mind, they weren't helpers. They were accomplices. Laura reviewed Daniel's daily routines. He lived alone in a modest apartment close to downtown. He had no criminal record of violence, no history of aggression, no disciplinary issues at work. He paid his bills on time. He volunteered occasionally at charity events, always behind the scenes. He was the last person anyone would suspect. That made him the most dangerous. Laura requested a discreet surveillance order, careful not to alert her superiors until she had more than suspicion. For days, officers watched Daniel from a distance. He followed the same routine every day. Work, groceries, home. Nothing unusual. No secret meetings. No late-night trips. Then Laura noticed something else. Daniel visited the gravesite of his sister every month on the same day. He stood there quietly, never staying long. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He simply stood, hands folded, as if reporting to someone who could no longer answer. After each visit, he returned home and wrote for hours. Laura obtained a warrant. The search of Daniel's apartment was conducted early in the morning. He answered the door calmly, surprised but cooperative. His home was clean and orderly. No weapons were visible. No signs of chaos or obsession. For a moment, Laura feared she had been wrong. Then they found the journals. They were hidden in a locked drawer beneath his desk, neatly stacked and carefully labeled by date. Inside, the writing was precise, controlled, and unsettlingly calm. Each journal contained names, dates, and short descriptions of individuals connected to rehabilitation programs. Some names were crossed out. Others were circled. A few had notes beside them, describing speeches they had given or letters they had written in support of parole. Every victim had a full page. Daniel didn't describe the killings with emotion. He described them as decisions, necessary actions, corrections. At the end of each page, written in the same neat handwriting, was the same phrase. Justice completed. Laura felt sick as she read. Daniel hadn't acted out of rage. He had acted out of belief. He believed the system was broken. He believed forgiveness was dangerous. And he believed it was his responsibility to stop those who promoted it. Daniel was arrested that afternoon without resistance. He didn't ask for a lawyer immediately. He didn't shout or protest. He simply nodded when told he was under arrest, as if this moment had always been part of the plan. During interrogation, Daniel spoke softly. He made eye contact. He answered questions directly. When asked why he targeted the victims, his response was simple. They chose criminals over victims, he said. Laura pressed him, asking if he felt any guilt. Daniel paused, considering the question carefully. I feel regret, he said. But not for what I did. Only that it took so long. He explained that killing the offenders wouldn't change anything. They were symptoms. The real problem was the belief that some crimes could be forgiven. That belief, he said, created more pain. More victims like his sister. He didn't see himself as a murderer. He saw himself as a correction. What haunted Laura most was how logical he sounded. Not convincing, but structured. There were no wild claims, no emotional outbursts. Daniel spoke like someone explaining a process, not confessing to a crime. When asked about the note left on the sixth victim, Daniel admitted it had been intentional. He wanted the message to spread. He wanted people to question forgiveness. He wanted the city to debate whether mercy had limits. He had never intended to run. Daniel believed the work was finished. As Laura left the interrogation room, she realized something deeply unsettling. If Daniel had not wanted to be caught, he might never have been. He had access, patience, and complete emotional control. The wrong arrest had proven how easily the system could be misled. Daniel hadn't just targeted one type of victim. He had exploited one type of trust. The trust people place in those who work quietly, unnoticed, behind the scenes. The arrest brought relief, but it was fragile. The city would soon celebrate the end of the nightmare. Headlines would declare the killer caught. But Laura knew the damage ran deeper than the body count. Because Daniel hadn't acted alone in spirit. He had acted on a belief shared by many. And that belief had not been arrested with him. The arrest of Daniel Cross should have marked the end of Brookhaven's nightmare. For many people, it did. News alerts spread quickly across phones and televisions, announcing that the killer had been caught. Reporters stood outside the police station describing Daniel as a quiet administrator, who had lived unnoticed among them for years. Candles were lit again, this time in relief. Families hugged each other a little tighter. The city tried to breathe. But for those closest to the case, especially Laura Finch, the ending did not feel complete. It felt heavy, unfinished, like the final note of a song that refuses to resolve. Daniel's confession was thorough. He admitted to every murder without hesitation. He described how he chose his victims, how he learned their schedules, how he approached them calmly so they would not feel fair. He spoke about planning each act carefully, making sure no one else was harmed, making sure the message stayed clear. He never raised his voice. He never asked for sympathy. What disturbed Laura most was not what Daniel said, but how certain he was while saying it. In the days that followed, Laura reviewed the recordings of his interrogations again and again. Daniel never once described himself as angry. He spoke of grief, yes, but grief that had hardened into something else. Something structured. He believed emotion was unreliable. Belief, he said, was stronger. He told investigators that forgiveness was a luxury society could not afford. That people who advocated for second chances were gambling with innocent lives. That his sister's death was not just the fault of the man who killed her, but of everyone who helped him walk free. They were part of it, Daniel said calmly. They just didn't hold the knife. The trial began 3 months later and drew national attention. The courtroom was filled every day, divided silently between families of the victims and those who came out of morbid curiosity. Daniel entered each morning in a plain suit, hands folded, eyes forward. He showed no emotion when the charges were read. No reaction when the photos were shown. No response when names were spoken. When it was his turn to testify, the room grew still. Daniel did not deny the killings. Instead, he explained them. He spoke about his sister, Emily, describing her kindness, her plans, her belief that people were mostly good. He spoke about the night she died and the moment he learned her killer would be released early. He described reading the parole letters, seeing the signatures of people who believed mercy mattered more than risk. To Daniel, those letters were decisions. Decisions that ended his sister's life before it even happened. I didn't want revenge, he told the court. Revenge is emotional. This was necessary. Gasps echoed through the room. Some people cried. Others stared, frozen. The prosecution pressed him, asking if he understood the pain he caused to the families of his victims. Daniel nodded. I understand, he said. I caused pain to prevent more. That sentence lingered in the air like smoke. Laura watched from the back of the courtroom, feeling a cold weight settle in her chest. She knew the law would find Daniel guilty. The evidence was overwhelming. But she also knew something more dangerous was happening in real time. People were listening. Online, debates exploded. Comment sections filled with arguments over justice and mercy. Some users condemned Daniel as a monster. Others, more quietly, expressed agreement with his ideas if not his actions. They spoke about fear, about repeat offenders, about stories that never made the news. Daniel's words spread far beyond the courtroom. That frightened Laura more than anything else. The verdict came quickly. Guilty on all counts. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge's voice was steady as he delivered the sentence, calling Daniel's actions calculated, immoral, and unforgivable. Families of the victims wept. Some felt relief. Others felt emptiness. Daniel listened without reaction. As he was led away, he turned briefly toward the gallery. His eyes passed over the families, over the reporters, over Laura. For a moment, their gazes met. There was no hatred there, no triumph, only certainty. In the weeks that followed, Brookhaven tried to return to normal. Police patrols decreased. News vans disappeared. Cafes reopened late. People smiled again, though the smiles came slower than before. Memorial plaques were installed. Scholarships were named after the victims. The city honored their work, their belief in helping others. But something had changed. Volunteer programs struggled to recover. Applications dropped sharply. Some people were afraid. Others were unsure. The question Daniel had forced into the open refused to go away. How much forgiveness is too much? Laura returned to her routine, but the case stayed with her. She began receiving emails from strangers thanking her for stopping the killer. Others accused her of protecting criminals. A few asked her what she believed. She didn't answer those messages. Late one evening, Laura visited the prison where Daniel was being held. She told herself it was professional, that there were still procedural questions to clarify. But deep down, she knew she needed to understand something for herself. Daniel agreed to see her. He looked the same as he had in court. Calm, controlled, almost relieved. Laura asked him if he felt the trial had been fair. Yes, Daniel said. It needed to be public. She asked him if he believed his message had been understood. He considered this. It's been heard, he replied. Understanding takes longer. Laura asked the question that had been haunting her since the beginning. Did you ever doubt yourself? Daniel was quiet for a long moment. No, he said finally. Doubt comes from uncertainty. I was never uncertain. Laura left the prison feeling colder than when she entered. Months passed. Then a year. The case slowly faded from headlines, replaced by new tragedies, new debates. But occasionally, Laura would come across the phrase Daniel had written on that first note. It appeared in comment threads, on signs at protests, whispered in conversations. Some sins should never be forgiven. She wondered how many people believed that now. How many always had. Brookhaven survived. It always would. Cities adapt. They heal. But scars don't vanish. They fade into reminders. The story of Daniel Cross became a cautionary tale told in criminal psychology courses and law seminars. It was framed as an example of moral absolutism taken to its extreme, of how belief, when stripped of empathy, can justify anything. But Laura knew the truth was more complicated. Daniel had not been born a killer. He had been shaped by loss, by fear, by a system that struggled to balance justice and mercy. That did not excuse what he did. Nothing could. But it explained how easily belief could turn into permission. The most unsettling part was this. Daniel had targeted only one type of victim. Not because they were weak. Not because they were careless. But because they represented an idea he could not tolerate. He did not kill for pleasure. He killed to erase a belief. And that belief, despite everything, still existed. As Laura stood one evening overlooking the city, watching lights flicker on in apartment windows, she understood the true ending of the case. The killer was gone. But the question he left behind was not. And perhaps it never would be.